Chicago, early 1980s. A city alive with noise, business, and nightlife. But in the shadows of the city lurked something darker than anyone could imagine. A group so terrifying their crimes would leave scars on America's history forever. They were called the Ripper Crew, and what they did was beyond murder. It was pure evil. In the early 1980s, Chicago was a city alive with ambition and crime in equal measure, but among its streets lived a man whose darkness would soon eclipse everything else. His name was Robin Gecht. Unlike the monsters you read about in fiction, Gecht blended in with everyday life. He was a construction worker, a husband, and even a father. Yet beneath this ordinary surface was a personality consumed by violence, control, and obsession. Gecht's story took an even more chilling twist when it was revealed that he once worked for John Wayne Gacy, one of America's most infamous serial killers. Although there's no evidence Gacy influenced him directly, the connection alone was haunting. It suggested Gecht had been in close proximity to evil long before he created his own. But Gecht wasn't just a violent man. He was manipulative. He had the kind of charisma that drew people in, convincing them to follow his commands without hesitation. To those around him, he wasn't just a leader. He was almost a cult figure. And that's exactly what he built. A secret cult that blended brutality with satanic rituals. At the heart of Gecht's obsession was something almost too grotesque to believe. He developed a disturbing fixation on women's breasts, a fixation that would later become central to the crimes of his group. According to testimonies, he claimed to hear voices urging him to perform rituals of blood and mutilation. He wasn't just killing for power or pleasure. He believed he was serving something darker, something beyond human understanding. Gecht's ability to mask this darkness in daily life made him all the more dangerous. To the outside world, he looked like any other working-class Chicago man, but when he gathered his followers in private, he became something else entirely. A self-styled high priest of death and suffering. His words carried weight, and his commands would push others to commit acts most people couldn't even imagine. What makes Robin Gecht stand out in the history of American crime isn't just the horror of his actions, but the fact that he largely evaded justice. While those who followed him ended up behind bars or on death row, Gecht walked free. Despite witness testimonies, despite being named as the orchestrator of rituals and mutilations, the evidence never tied him directly to the murders, and so the leader of one of the most terrifying killing crews in U.S. history has lived his life outside prison walls, a chilling reminder that sometimes true evil doesn't get caught. Robin Gecht wasn't just a man. To his followers, he was a prophet of darkness, a manipulator who turned violence into ritual, and ritual into a way of life. Without him, there would be no Ripper Crew. He was the spark that ignited the nightmare. Every cult has a leader, but no leader can carry out horrors alone. Behind Robin Gecht were three men, ordinary on the surface, but transformed into willing participants in acts of unimaginable cruelty. Their names were Edward Spreitzer, Andrew Kokoraleis, and Thomas Kokoraleis. History remembers them not just as accomplices, but as crucial parts of the machinery of death known as the Ripper Crew. Edward Spreitzer was perhaps the most devoted follower. In 1981, he was just 19 years old when he met Robin Gecht. What should have been the beginning of an ordinary young adult life instead became a descent into a world of violence. Spreitzer was impressionable, easily manipulated, and Gecht saw in him someone he could mold into a loyal servant. Soon Spreitzer was doing more than just listening. He was helping Gecht lure victims, restrain them, and commit unspeakable acts. His loyalty to Gecht was so intense that even after arrest, he admitted to carrying out orders as though they were commands from a higher power. Then came the Kokoraleis brothers. Andrew and Thomas. They were raised in a troubled household, and by the time they fell under Gecht's influence, they were already struggling to find their place in the world. To some they appeared meek, even vulnerable, but under Gecht's guidance, they became something far darker. The brothers provided not only manpower, but also the willingness to carry out the cult's rituals, no matter how grotesque. Andrew Kokoraleis was known to be more aggressive, while Thomas often seemed like the follower of the follower, a man who lacked the strength to resist either his brother or Gecht. But together they formed the backbone of Gecht's twisted family. Gecht provided the ideology, the vision, and the perverse instructions. The followers carried it out, ensuring that his violent fantasies became reality. What makes their story especially chilling is how ordinary they looked. These were not monsters with glaring signs of danger. They were young men from the neighborhoods of Chicago. Men you might pass on the street, never guessing they were involved in nightly rituals of torture and mutilation. And that's the horror of the Ripper crew. It wasn't just one sadistic killer. It was a group bound together by loyalty, manipulation, and shared obsession. During the investigation, each of these men revealed disturbing details of their involvement. Spreitzer confessed to several murders, describing them with a flat tone that suggested he no longer even recognized the humanity of the victims. The Kokoraleis brothers told investigators about Gecht's rituals, about the mutilations, and about how they believed they were serving a greater evil purpose. But perhaps the most terrifying part is this: without Robin Gecht, it's possible none of them would have committed these crimes. Gecht's influence was the spark, but the followers were the hands that carried out the violence. They obeyed not because they had to, but because under his control they wanted to. In the story of the Ripper crew, the followers prove a chilling truth. Sometimes evil doesn't just spread through one person. It multiplies, infecting others until an entire group becomes capable of horrors no single killer could achieve alone. Between 1981 and 1982, Chicago lived with a terror most people never even realized was happening until it was too late. The Ripper crew roamed the city's streets and suburbs, preying on women who were vulnerable, alone, or simply unlucky enough to cross their path. Over the span of just 2 years, this group carried out some of the most brutal and sadistic crimes in American history. Their method was almost always the same. Victims were typically women walking alone, often sex workers, sometimes just everyday people heading home. The crew drove a red van, a vehicle that became a symbol of death for those who entered it. Once inside, the victims were trapped, the doors locked, and the nightmare began. Inside that van, the Ripper crew transformed from ordinary men into instruments of horror. Victims were tied, gagged, and subjected to torture that defies imagination. This wasn't just about killing. It was about ritual, about feeding Gecht's obsession and the crew's twisted belief in satanic power. According to confessions, women were assaulted and mutilated in ways that still shock investigators who studied the case. Most horrifying of all, the crew developed a ritual of cutting off their victims' breasts. The mutilated body parts were taken back to Robin Gecht's home, where they were placed inside what he called a satanic chapel in his attic. There, the crew performed rituals they believed connected them to dark forces, consuming flesh in a mockery of religious communion. The killings were brutal, but what set them apart was the deliberate, almost ceremonial nature of the violence. This was not the chaos of impulsive murder. It was structured, planned, repeated. Each killing fed into the next, creating a cycle of cruelty that seemed unstoppable. Police would later estimate that the crew was responsible for the deaths of at least 18 women, though some believe the real number could be higher. Many of the women vanished without a trace. Their bodies never recovered. Families were left without answers, unaware that their loved ones had fallen victim to one of the most sadistic groups America had ever seen. For Chicago residents, the fear was silent but pervasive. Women disappeared, rumors spread, but no one could connect the dots. The city had faced crime before, but this was something new, something organized, ritualistic, and almost otherworldly in its cruelty. Each member of the crew played a role. Gecht orchestrated the rituals and controlled the group's actions. Spreitzer and the Kokoraleis brothers were the enforcers, the ones who carried out the physical violence. Together they created a deadly machine, operating under the guise of satanic devotion and Gecht's twisted leadership. By the time police finally began piecing the case together, the damage was already done. Dozens of lives had been shattered, and the city's streets had become hunting grounds for a group whose crimes blurred the line between reality and nightmare. The Ripper Crew's crimes weren't just murders. They were acts of ritualistic evil, designed to dehumanize victims, glorify violence, and feed a cult leader's obsession. And for 2 years they did it unchecked, leaving behind a legacy of horror that Chicago has never forgotten. What separated the Ripper Crew from many other killers wasn't just the violence of their crimes, it was the rituals that followed. For Robin Gecht and his followers, murder wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something they believed carried deeper meaning. In their twisted world, every act of mutilation, every cut, every drop of blood was part of a satanic ceremony they had built around Gecht's obsession. According to testimony, the rituals always revolved around women's breasts. This wasn't random brutality. It was an obsession that Gecht had turned into a dark form of worship. After a victim was attacked, the crew would slice off the breasts and preserve them. These body parts were not discarded. They were treated as sacred offerings. Gecht kept what he called a satanic chapel in the attic of his home. It was a crude, makeshift space where he gathered his followers after the killings. Inside, candles flickered, an altar stood in place, and the mutilated remains of victims became part of the ritual. For the crew, this was more than crime. It was devotion to darkness. The most chilling detail of these ceremonies came from the confessions of the Kokoraleis brothers and Spreitzer. They described how the group would take the severed breasts, cut them into pieces, and eat them in what Gecht called a form of communion. It was a mockery of Christian practice, twisted into something unrecognizable and horrifying. In their minds, they weren't just eating flesh, they were binding themselves to Satan, consuming power, and sealing loyalty to their leader. Gecht insisted that these acts gave them strength. He told his followers that by performing these rituals, they were not only pleasing Satan, but also creating a spiritual bond that tied them together as a group. This belief turned the murders into more than just crimes. It made them ceremonies of belonging. For the followers, it was terrifyingly effective. It erased guilt, silenced doubt, and made them feel part of something larger than themselves. What's equally disturbing is how methodical it all was. The rituals were not improvised. They had structure, rules, and meaning, at least in Gecht's mind. He cast himself as the high priest of this dark faith, and the others followed as disciples. The fact that ordinary young men could be convinced to mutilate, eat human flesh, and believe they were serving a higher purpose shows just how deep Gecht's control went. Investigators later revealed these details with horror. Even seasoned detectives struggled to process the testimonies. This wasn't a simple case of murder for money or revenge. It was ritualized, spiritualized, and repeated again and again until it became the very identity of the group. For the Ripper Crew, killing was never just killing. It was religion, a blasphemous form of worship where blood was the offering, flesh was the sacrament, and Gecht was the prophet. And as long as the rituals continued, the crew felt untouchable, as if they were chosen instruments of a power greater than themselves. In truth, what they had created was nothing more than a cycle of terror and depravity. But to them, it was holy, and that belief made them unstoppable until the law finally caught up. By late 1982, Chicago police were under mounting pressure. Women were vanishing, mutilated bodies were appearing, and whispers about a red van prowling the streets had spread fear across entire neighborhoods. But until one mistake, the Ripper crew remained faceless shadows in the night. The break came when Edward Spreitzer and Thomas Kokoraleis drew police attention. A woman had managed to escape after a terrifying encounter, giving authorities descriptions of her attackers and their vehicle. With that lead, investigators zeroed in on the crew. Once in custody, the facade of loyalty began to crack. Under interrogation, Spreitzer folded first. He confessed to multiple murders, and piece by piece revealed the gruesome rituals the crew performed. The details were so shocking that even hardened detectives struggled to believe them. When the Kokoraleis brothers were questioned, their statements lined up with Spreitzer's confessions. They described the red van, the abductions, the mutilations, and the chilling chapel in Gecht's attic where rituals had taken place. But there was one problem: Robin Gecht. Despite being named repeatedly as the ringleader, Gecht proved far more slippery. Police searched his home, and while they found disturbing evidence, like makeshift altars and pornographic material, they couldn't uncover enough physical proof linking him directly to the murders. No bodies, no forensic smoking gun. He had been careful, leaving his followers to get their hands bloody while he orchestrated from behind the scenes. In court, the prosecutions against Spreitzer and the Kokoraleis brothers were strong. Their confessions, coupled with corroborating evidence, painted a damning picture. The trials laid bare the horrifying details of the Ripper crew's crimes, shocking the public with testimony about cannibalistic rituals and satanic devotion. Families of the victims sat in courtrooms, forced to relive the horror as the killers described what had been done to their loved ones. Edward Spreitzer received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His youth had not saved him from the weight of his crimes. Andrew Kokoraleis, seen as one of the most active participants, was sentenced to death. In 1999, after years of appeals, he was executed by lethal injection, becoming the last person Illinois ever executed before the state abolished the death penalty. Thomas Kokoraleis, viewed as the weakest link, received a lighter sentence and was eventually released in 2019 after decades behind bars. His release sparked outrage, reopening old wounds for the families of the victims. And then there was Robin Gecht, the man described by all as the leader, the manipulator, the so-called priest of the cult, walked free. Though arrested and tried on charges of sexual assault in a separate case, he was never convicted for the murders. His name haunted the court records, but his freedom haunted Chicago even more. The trials revealed not just the crimes but the psychology of the crew. They showed how ordinary young men had been drawn into a web of violence through manipulation, fear, and belief. They also highlighted the frustrating limits of the justice system, how the one most responsible slipped through the cracks. For Chicago, the arrests brought relief, but the fact that the mastermind avoided conviction left a bitter taste, one that lingers decades later. Justice had been served to some, but not to all. When the trials ended, the city of Chicago exhaled in relief. The nightmare of the Ripper crew was finally over, or at least that's what people wanted to believe. Justice had been delivered in pieces, but the aftermath of this case would prove just as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Edward Spreitzer, Only 19 when he joined the crew, was handed multiple life sentences. He would never walk free again. To this day, he sits behind bars in Illinois, his name forever tied to some of the most depraved crimes the state has ever seen. For many, his imprisonment was a small comfort, but it did little to erase the horror of what he had confessed. Andrew Kokoraleis, often considered the most active of the brothers, received the harshest punishment. He was sentenced to death. After nearly 2 decades of appeals and legal battles, his execution took place in March 1999. He was put to death by lethal injection, the last man Illinois ever executed before the state abolished capital punishment. For families of the victims, Andrew's execution was closure of a kind, though it could never bring back the women whose lives had been stolen. Thomas Kokoraleis was a different story. His role in the crew was seen as less central, and his sentence reflected that. After decades behind bars, he was released in 2019. His freedom outraged the public and terrified many Chicagoans. Imagine living in a city where one of the men tied to such gruesome crimes suddenly walked among you again. Protests erupted, and victims' families spoke out, horrified that justice had allowed him back into society. His release became a reminder that time doesn't always heal wounds, it can reopen them. And then there was Robin Gecht, the man at the center of it all. While his followers named him as the leader, the so-called high priest of their satanic rituals, Gecht never faced murder charges. Police could never tie him directly to the killings. He was convicted only of a sexual assault and sentenced to prison, but not for life. To this day, Gecht remains a free man. The thought that the mastermind of the Ripper crew lives outside prison walls chills both investigators and families of victims. It is one of the darkest stains on the case, the idea that true evil walked away untouched. The aftermath of the Ripper crew continues to echo through Chicago's history. The case is studied by criminologists and psychologists as an example of cult mentality, manipulation, and ritualistic crime. For the families of victims, however, it's not a study, it's a lifelong scar. They lost daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends, often with no remains to bury. The story of the Ripper crew isn't just about what happened in the early 1980s. It's about what lingered after, the fear, the outrage, and the haunting knowledge that some wounds never truly close. The sentences brought partial justice, but never enough, because as long as Robin Gecht walks free, the shadow of the Ripper crew still hangs over Chicago. The Ripper crew's crimes remain some of the most disturbing in American history. Their story forces us to face a chilling truth. Evil doesn't just hide in myths or legends, it walks among us. And sometimes it rides in a van through the dark streets of a city.